Welcome back to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. Thomas Paine believed that Americans must control their constitutions of government, that they should revise and update it every generation. But the framers, subverting Paine's vision of a democratically controlled government, intentionally left out of their constitution any process through which the people could do just that. As Jerry Fresia points out in episode 3, that was because their constitution was designed to prioritize the individual accumulation of wealth and property over the well-being of society as a whole. The framers did not want that system to be changed. In fact, as we are about to find out, they really did not want that system to even work, and peaceful political revolution was to be repressed at all costs. In the previous episode, we discussed the kinds of changes we could make to our Constitution, which would make it more effective and democratic. We also noted that Americans, unlike in any other country, have an unusual reverence for their Constitution. As a consequence, our Constitution has remained frozen for over 230 years. Before we can even begin to think about making changes to our Constitution, like the ones we discussed in episode 4, we need to understand more about this rather bizarre reverence Americans have for their Constitution. For that, I've asked Daniel Lazar to talk with us about his book, The Frozen Republic. There are more than a few big changes to our national charter that are widely considered to be more effective and democratic than the ones we use today. We have talked about many of them already, yet those democratic improvements are essentially being ignored, even rejected by Americans, because Americans are captured by the very political system they are supposed to control. Americans don't think about changing their Constitution or making a better one, because they blindly believe it is perfect and therefore impossible to improve. Americans are largely unable to think rationally about the dysfunction of our political system or to express peacefully how it might be changed. We no longer understand how political systems even work, and we are afraid of each other. We no longer even want to control our constitutions of government. We'd rather suffer the intolerable consequences of a system driving us all over the edge than to dare to imagine we could create a better political system than the one we have inherited. It appears our Constitution now controls us. We must obey it rather than critique it, and apparently Americans prefer this kind of bondage to exercising their right to control their systems of government and to protect their liberty from the tyranny of the past. Daniel Lazar is a journalist and the author of The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. And he has been a long outspoken critic of the almost religious reverence of our Constitution. And he is here today to explain why. Daniel, welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, nice to be talking to you. This is great. Look, this is a remarkable book, and it's probably the first book that I ever read about this rather crazy reverence for our Constitution, which Aaron Liphart brought up in our last episode, Patterns of Democracy. You aren't the first to notice this, but I think you may be the first to explain it so well. I have some ideas, but for starters, maybe you could explain what you mean by the title, The Frozen Republic.
Well, this reverence, in a sense, it's mandated by law. It's not that Americans are naturally reverent, but they're required to be. The founders were a mixed bag. There's some things I like about them, some things I don't. But they were very good lawyers. And essentially, they drew up a contract with America, which was extraordinarily tight and well constructed. I mean, if ever there was an unbreakable contract, this was it. It reminds me of the devil and Daniel Webster, when the devil, draws up a contract that this farmer who falls into his clutches just can't escape. And it's a great contract, and Daniel Webster does succeed in breaking it eventually. But this contract was a kind of an elaborate set of laws, or a quasi treaty among 13 states. It created a much more powerful central government than anyone had expected a few years earlier, which I like. But then it sealed the bargain by essentially locking everyone in with a fairly restrictive amending clause. And that amending clause, as you may remember from your high school days, says that that not so much as a comma can be changed in the Constitution without the approval of 2/3 of each house, the House and Senate, plus 3/4 of the states. And that was a very severe barrier. And back then, that's the 3/4 rule meant that 4 out of 13 states, representing as little as 10% of the U.S. population, could veto any constitutional change. And that was very severe. And because of that, after the 11th and 12th Amendment, which passed in 1803, I believe, there wasn't another amendment for another 60 plus years. And that meant that the slavery issue, which was deeply embedded in the Constitution, couldn't be addressed. So as a consequence, the issue ended up being addressed, but ended up being addressed extra constitutionally via civil war, which claimed the lives of at least 2.5% of the U.S. population, a very, very bloody, bad war. So you had a 10% veto back in 1790, whereas 10% of the population could veto any constitutional change. Today, the 3/4 rule means that 13 states out of 50 can veto any constitutional change. And that means the 13 states can account for as little as 4.4% of the U.S. population.
Wow.
That's about one person in 23 or 24. And that number is declining. According to population projections, it'll be down to like 4.1 by the year 2040. So you have a constitution which is 230 odd years old. It's completely at odds with the needs of modern society, I would argue. Yet it's growing more change-averse rather than less, more rigid, more change-averse than it ever was before. And to me, this is a recipe for disaster.
This is what Aaron Lippert pointed out in the previous episode, that for example, the presidential system was extremely rigid, and there was no way to change parts of our political system, and it was a real detriment to our society. You begin the book with the observation that America was and still is a very religious society. You also say we have a reverence for the founders, yet at the same time we are cursing the political system they gave us. It's odd, isn't it? So Americans think of the framers as saints, but they complain about their politics to no end. And you also observe things might seem to be falling apart. So, what are we to do? What do we make of this?
Oh, So what are we to do? What is to be done? I mean, the country is locked in to an increasingly rigid constitutional structure, which grows worse and worse. And that structure is breaking down, by the way. I mean, we had a coup d'etat just less than 12 months ago, an attempted coup d'etat. We've had 30 years of gridlock on Capitol Hill. We've had 2 stolen presidential elections out of the last 6, and I would warrant that 2024 is going to be stolen as well. And our society is breaking down.
Yeah, I'd have to say to the previous election, when Bernie Sanders got sidelined, I'm beginning to see that now as a political coup itself by the Democratic Party.
The coups are piling up. The political processes are breaking down. They're growing more irregular, and there's kind of a brutal mud wrestling match happening behind the scenes. I mean, Russiagate, which I think was phony from top to bottom, was a kind of coup, an attempt to drive Trump out of office through extra legal means. Now, people, I'm sure you and your listeners don't like Donald Trump, so it would not have been terribly sad to see him go under those circumstances. But still, it's a substitution of unconstitutional means for constitutional means. And we're seeing more of that because our system is breaking down, but it's growing more change averse. And so therefore, we're stuck. I mean, what do we do? And the answer, the only answer is to sort of take a giant leap into the unknown. I mean, Jefferson talked about that. Jefferson said, that the Declaration of Independence was not really kind of a rational act. It was a great kind of leap into the unknown. They had no idea, how it would end.
Interesting.
They could all wind up swinging from a yard arm. They believed it had to be done, but it required a giant leap into the unknown.
Because there was this discussion going on about we fought for our independence from Britain, and as well, we wanted to set up a government that the people would control. But unfortunately, it probably seemed to them at the time that this idea that the people would control their governments may not be such a great idea. I mean, I kind of feel a little sympathy for the framers in that respect, because we pointed out again and again that there were so many internal conflicts. There was external threats from 4 or 5 different countries, the slave rebellions, the Native American attacks. So they were under a lot of stress to keep things together. And, it seems like, well, maybe they just felt like it's time to, circle the wagons and let the elites try to figure out what was best for everybody.
Well, there was a bit of that. Yeah. I mean, things worked out. I mean, throwing out the British was relatively easy. I mean, it wasn't, of course. It was a serious war, and I'm joking, but creating a new nation was very difficult. In some ways, more difficult, because the 13 colonies had nothing in common. I mean, New England and Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia had little in common with one another. Travel was easier between Boston and London than it was between Boston and Savannah, Georgia. There were no internal roads, for example. There were a few internal roads, but they were very bad and took a long time. And the different sections didn't know one another. They were English speaking and Protestant almost, overwhelmingly. But there also was a slavery problem, which everyone sort of hoped would solve on its own, but of course that didn't happen. So there were huge problems, and the founders, I said, were very good lawyers, and they put together a really tight package, which held the country together, but it was in some ways too tight because the whole thing completely exploded in 1861. And then they patched it together with minimal changes. And now we're seeing the whole thing explode again in 2021. And there's no doubt it's exploding. And in fact, in some ways, it's worse than the Civil War, because at least the Civil War, at least secession was a kind of an escape valve. But now that secession has been closed off, there is no escape valve. So therefore, Americans are now fighting a civil war against each other with no way out, and no clear way of resolving it.
Right. I talk to people all the time about creating a new constitution for the United States, a modern, fully democratic constitution, like a lot of the countries, as you pointed out, and we'll talk about later, a lot of European countries did after World War II. And I want to talk about that in some detail in a few minutes. But there's so much to cover in this book. It's really it's remarkable because it's very dense, but if this conversation is relevant to any of the listeners, the book is really going to just grab your attention. It's a great read. And you talk, for example, about the 1832 Reform Bill in England, something that I didn't know about. What was that, and why is it impossible to understate its importance?
Well, so Uh, America and England are two very close cousins. And we parted ways in 1776, but our political development has been really parallel in many respects. So, but in the 1770s and 80s, Britain had a parliamentary system, but it was amazingly corrupt. There were no elections, few people could vote. Power was in the hands of large-scale merchants and landowners, and it was greased by corruption in a way you can't imagine. And during the French Revolution, England was leader of the Great Counter-Revolution. They were marshaling all the reactionary forces in Europe to oppose the French Revolution. So they were, in some ways, they were modern and almost, but not quite democratic. But in other ways, they were profoundly backwards and reactionary. But in 1832, in response to industrialization and a growing popular clamor for change, Parliament realized that something had to be done to put the whole system on the path to modernization. And so the suffrage was widened. I mean, I think still the figure is that only 1 person in 6 could still vote, but that was far more than it was previously. And Parliament began operating the government on a way that was much more modern, efficient, up to date. And those tendencies sort of gathered force throughout the 19th century, so that the English, the British model, became very, very influential. It was still very conservative, but it was amazingly liberal in the classic sense of the word. Karl Marx wound up as a refugee in London, and the cruelest thing the British ruling class did to Marx was to ignore him. They didn't persecute him. They didn't throw him in jail. They didn't hound him. They were much worse. They left him alone and ignored him. Of course, that was a token of their liberalism and their self-confidence and their belief that they sort of had developed efficient governing mechanisms. When you look at America, the story is really different because, on some ways, America was much more advanced. We had universal suffrage, essentially. Universal white male suffrage, I should emphasize, by the Jacksonian era in the 1830s. You had no aristocracy. The term the Americans couldn't even comprehend what an aristocrat meant. I mean, all white males were on the same legal footing, so and that way it was very advanced. But at the same time, starting around the 1820s, or even the 18 teens, you have Americans beating their breast and trying to figure out, why this damn thing doesn't work. I mean, why are there all these, these bitter intramural battles on Capitol Hill? Why does government so damn inefficient? On one hand, it's very democratic. On the other hand, it's oddly removed from democracy. Because the people sort of can't get this ship of state to sail where they wanted to sail, and that grew more and more acute during the slavery battles from the 1820s on, when Congress at one point refused to hear any anti-slavery appeals at all, and the U.S. mails were used to censor any anti-slavery literature from reaching the South. So how could this great democratic state suddenly behaved so undemocratically? It was a great puzzle. And then there was the Civil War, and that was an attempt to answer it, but in some ways it succeeded marvelously, but in other ways it just fell dramatically short. So that after the Civil War, things, the status quo ante was rapidly restored. And corruption skyrocketed. America became the classic plutocracy, and things have kind of staggered on ever since. But the country has grown incredibly powerful over the time, and Americans in general were so thrilled about being part of this giant enterprise, this giant national enterprise, that they grew intensely patriotic and believed that there's nothing America couldn't conquer. But now it's in trouble.
What kinds of things did the Reform Bill of 1832 provide for?
It mainly broadened the suffrage's
Okay.
so that essentially a far broader segment of the population could take part in elections. And then in the 1860s, the suffrage was broadened even more.
I see.
So by the 1860s, you had manual workers being able to vote.
I see.
And then the 1880s and 90s were the first stirrings of a proto-labor party. You actually had the emergence of the beginnings of a workers' political movement.
I see.
Where they could agitate for freedom of trade unions, freedom to strike, welfare provisions, etc.
Yeah, that's a big deal then.
That's something we haven't reached ourselves, by the way. We have no workers' party, no labor party, anything remotely that. We have only two business parties.
Incredible. So who is Jeremy Bentham? You write he wrote President Andrew Jackson in 1830, suggesting he abolished the Senate. And Aaron Lippert recommended the same thing in the previous episode.
It should be abolished. It should be torn into little splinters. It should be pounded underfoot.
Wouldn't that be great to see those guys running for the hills? I mean, it's packed with millionaires. So we have a bicameral legislature. A lot of our listeners might not even know the difference between a unicameral legislature and a bicameral legislature. But in our case, we have a bicameral legislature. Aaron Lippert is recommending, and I also agree, we should have a unicameral legislature where we send our representatives to go to work, and we can see what's going on, and we know who's there, we know what's happening, we can keep track of things. The system we have right now is completely impossible to follow. I mean, it's very complex.
You'd have to put an investigative reporter to work for 6 months merely to find out the true story of how any single congressman or congresswoman vote. Mm-hmm. So now then imagine trying to do that with a 535 congressmen and senators. You realize how absolutely impossible it is. There is no accountability at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, Jeremy Bentham, he's a very quirky guy who is a remarkable philosopher who essentially burst on the scene in 1776, the first book, the same year the Declaration of Independence was drafted. Essentially, he was a great simplifier. And what he said is that society is about increasing the aggregate happiness. And whatever does that is good, and whatever impedes that is bad. And the aggregate happiness meant the greater good for the greatest number.
Sounds like Thomas Paine a bit.
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, Paine said similar things. I mean, Paine was not nearly as systematic as Bentham was, but Paine actually, in some ways, was more advanced initially, because actually Bentham was cold to the French Revolution, whereas, of course, Paine was an enthusiastic proponent and participant.
Yeah. Did they know each other?
No. I'm pretty sure not. I can't say that positively, but I'm pretty sure not.
Wow.
So the idea of the greater good for the greatest number implied, first of all, it implied majority rule, it implied democratic majority rule. Mm-hmm. In other words, if 51% of the people believe that policy X will benefit them, and that's the law. Policy X is put into effect. And if then that 51% majority slips into a 49% minority, because 2% have decided, they changed their mind, then policy X is out of power.
Yeah, see, that's interesting because Madison always talked about, protecting the minorities. We think about that as being minority rights, but he was talking about the elites and protecting their property, right? So this idea becomes it later on. I want to go into that too, about how government is a threat, and the majority is a threat, but it really is a mind game when you think about it. I mean, I think the majority should be getting their way.
Yes, I agree totally. Madison, by the way, was not only about protecting the rights of the property of the rich. In fact, that's kind of a common misunderstanding, because even more important to him was protecting sectoral rights.
Sectoral rights.
the rights of the Southern planters against intrusion by the emerging Northern manufacturers and bankers. Remember, Madison was a slave owner who had more than 100 slaves in his possession, and his first loyalty was to that system and protecting it.
Sounds like Jefferson's fear of the urban class.
Yes, I always maintain that every word Jefferson wrote, including and, if, and the, was somehow in defense of the Virginia planters. So essentially, what Madison wanted to do is he wanted to freeze the economy in place by essentially, limiting the North to its little sphere and limiting the South to its little sphere, and essentially preventing one from trespassing on the other's turf. But of course, you believe in a dynamic economy, as Hamilton did, then they can't help but trespass on each other's turf. That's inevitable. And in fact, it's even desirable because you want a dynamic economy. So Madison believed in the opposite of Bentham, where Bentham believed in the greater good for the greater number. Madison believed in a kind of ghettoized economy where, what all that matters is the greater good for the greater number of planters. And no one, of course, is even going to even consult for a second with the slaves and what they thought. And that up north it could be the greater good for the greater number, whatever they wanted, but just stay on your side of the line. And that's the thing that the fundamentally reactionary aspect of Madison's thinking, but one that was baked into the Constitution, which then exploded.
Yeah, there's so much to go into in your book about the slavocracy, apportionment, states' rights, and why our Constitution is so rigid. And Aaron Lippard again also mentioned this aspect of rigidity, as I said earlier, and which is part of our overall constitutional design. Can you connect the ideas here that are central to this aspect of the frozen republic?
Yeah, well, the republic is frozen because essentially the amending clause limits change to dribs and drabs. Change in the political sphere, I should say, political legal sphere. Ronald Reagan thought that was great because he wanted Americans to stay away from politics and concentrate on economic dynamism. And to a certain extent, that remark by Reagan was really perceptive. But when you close the door to political change, you lock in all these structures, which made a great deal of sense back in the 1780s, but don't make any sense to us now. I mean, a Senate based on equal state representation, that doesn't make any sense at all. There's nothing about a New Jersey or a Missouri or a California, that sort of warrants special representation, in and of themselves, right? We Americans move frequently. We move from state to state. We don't think anything about moving from New York to New Jersey or California to Oregon. It's not like moving from France to Belgium. And so this whole idea of state representation has gone out the window. And the only reason it survives is because it serves as a brake on true democracy and because it's baked into the structure. It just can't be removed, even though it's getting worse and worse.
Wow. On page 90, you write about the role of the 3/5 clause in 1820 and the principle of equal state representation in the Senate, which gave the southern states disproportionate influence over the Electoral College and judicial appointments in which they used to veto any amendments to the Constitution. So this power was a real threat to the northern states, but it eventually led to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. Could the Civil War have been avoided had we been able to change or repair a Constitution in 1820?
Yeah, of course, that's the great tragedy. If America had been a true democracy, slavery couldn't coexist in a true democracy, and there were still things like racial prejudice, which were not to be underestimated. But once a majority of voters decided that slavery was just incompatible with everything they believed in, then plainly slavery would go. Because it just, the people wanted it out, therefore it would be out. And most of the founders, including Washington, and even to a degree, including Jefferson, sort of assumed that slavery would fade away on its own. But they proved to be completely diametrically wrong, because the Constitution actually had built-in protections that allowed slavery to spread and grow and become much more powerful than anyone ever anticipated. The Marquis de Lafayette, he said, if I knew this was going to happen, that the new republic would head off in this direction, I would never have raised my sword in its defense to begin with. So the Constitution, it had the 3/5 clause, which by the 1850s gave the South 25 extra seats in the House and 25 extra votes in the Electoral College, which is why until 1850, the only non-slave owners in the White House were the Adamses, John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. 25 extra seats in the House and parity in the Senate. Equal number of states. That was Missouri Compromise. The North and South agreed to maintain parity in the Senate. So that meant that any kind of constitutional remedy to the problem of slavery was blocked in perpetuity, and that a constitutional amendment just was unattainable. And this is despite the fact is that starting in the 18 teens and 20s, but certainly by the 1830s, America started industrializing really rapidly. It became kind of the wonder of the world. It started drawing in huge numbers of immigrants. And suddenly the northern population, and in the 1780s, the South had been richer than the North. Massachusetts was little more than a collection of peddlers and shoemakers, that kind of stuff. And whereas George Washington was, I read somewhere recently that it was actually worth $500 million in today's currency. So he was actually an immensely wealthy man, whereas the New Englanders were actually very humble, poor people. But by the 1820s and 30s, that was changing rapidly. The North was growing in numbers and wealth, and actually Virginia was falling behind. It was growing poorer and poorer. So, and Northern workers, whatever their prejudices may have been, they couldn't support slavery because slavery drove wages down. The conditions of poor farmers and poor white workers in the South was the conditions were ruinous. They were impoverished. They had no schooling, no education. They were often reduced to near starvation, which is why many of them fled to the North, including among them Abraham Lincoln's parents were refugees from the South who fled to the North.
No kidding.
Oh, yeah. So, but nonetheless, they were powerless because they couldn't overcome these built-in safeguards that the Constitution had put in place.
Yeah, I remember hearing the aristocracy, they were saying that the end of slavery wouldn't be all that bad because they could pick up workers for almost half the price that it was to have a slave.
Yeah, well, that's true. Slaves were very expensive by the 1850s. As someone said, they cost the equivalent of a new Mercedes-Benz.
Is that right? So they began to see it as maybe an advantage to get rid of slavery because it would be less expensive.
Some people felt that way.
Yeah.
But the planters who had made this immense investment in slavery did not.
Did not, right, because they were invested,
Yeah.
Yeah. You write later on in page 167 that after World War II, Europe went through this kind of democratic revival, whereas America went into a victory-induced coma about the righteousness of the American constitutional system. Once again, America fooled itself into thinking its political system was the source of everything good. But you explain why that wasn't so, and it isn't so today.
In certain ways, there's nothing worse than total victory, and nothing better than abject defeat. Because first of all, no country was in a position like America was in 1945. It had half the world's gold supply, half the world's manufacturing capacity.
Wow.
The war years, Americans look back on the war years as a happy time. For the rest of the world, they were an unprecedented nightmare.
Yeah.
But for Americans, they were a time of full employment, high wages, and also a sense of incredible, victory and triumph.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're victorious, I mean, what that tells you is like everything you've been doing is right, and therefore keep on doing it, and you'll always be victorious.
So how do you know that it's not the political system that was responsible for that victory? I mean, how do you distinguish between the result that we were experiencing and the actual system itself?
History is complicated, and I wish it was really simple. That'd make things a lot better, but it's not. It's complicated. So America, in some ways, as I said before, in some ways, it was a democratic country certainly compared to what was happening in Europe in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, fascism made minimal inroads into the United States. Most Americans, I mean, virtually all Americans, were shocked and appalled by what was happening under the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even Southern segregationists were shocked by the Nazis.
Mm.
And so Americans, so the American government succeeded in mobilizing this all this incredible industrial, and popular support. Americans, fought the war, and they fought it, very aggressively and very eagerly. But the lesson they concluded was that everything that they had been doing at that moment had been right, and therefore let's keep on doing it.
Sweden, which had been, this is on page 179, Sweden, which had been neutral in the war, scrapped a much patched over constitution that was nearly as old as the American one and substituted a revamped, up-to-date document under Prime Minister Olof Palme in 76. And where the old constitution had been issued in the name of the king, the new one began with a flat-out declaration that, quote, all the power in Sweden emanates from the people. Denmark abolished its upper house in parliament and approved a new constitution in 1953, while the Dutch, not to be outdone, did the same in 1972 and then another in 83. France adopted a new constitution in 1958, its 16th since the revolution, and Portugal adopted one in 1976 that was heavily revised in 1982 and again in 1989. A bit farther afield, Australians began debating dropping their allegiance to the British crown as part of the general reorientation to the burgeoning economies of Asia, while New Zealanders revamped their voting laws by dropping a first-past-the-post British system and adopting one based on proportional representation instead, which we talked about in the previous episode. There's lots of changes to the constitutions for different countries in Europe and around the world, but the United States, nothing.
Exactly, because the lesson that Americans drew, was to stand pat, keep on doing what they were doing, and to sort of retreat into this kind of fortress conservative mentality.
Well, they were experiencing tremendous success economically.
They were experiencing success like none the world had ever seen.
Yeah,
and so therefore they didn't want to rock the boat.
Yeah, it's a tough argument to beat. I mean, we all like to talk about jobs, and the economy. That's the main topic. It's never, are people getting things? Are people getting what they want out of the system? It's always about the economy.
But life, in life, there are winners and losers, and but they often change places. He was first, will now be last, and vice versa. And so all these upstart countries like Holland or Denmark. I mean, Americans, since when do Americans care about Holland or Denmark?
Yeah.
But they had certain insights because they had taken sort of battering. They realized they couldn't rest on their laurels because they had no laurels to rest on.
Yeah.
So therefore, they had to, rethink things from the bottom up, and they democratized their societies in very profound ways. Whereas Americans stuck with the same old Madisonian formulas.
Now we have such wealth disparity in this country. It's historic, I guess. And I'm in the Bay Area. You can't go around the corner without seeing homeless people everywhere.
Yeah, that's amazing. No, America is a great imperial republic, and empires always have these discrepancies. I mean, they seek glory abroad while their people are starving at home. This is ancient Rome is the same way. Britain in the 18th century was in the same way. I mean, conditions in London were notorious. Right through the 19th century.
Incredible. Yeah.
And we're seeing the same thing here. Yeah, there's Americans reaped a lot of glory in World War II, not so much in Vietnam or Afghanistan, but certainly a lot in World War II. But they paid for that with a worsening conditions for their people at home. And those conditions are declining. I mean, it's getting scary out there. You know that. Just another number of homeless in the Bay Area. The opiate epidemic, 100,000 people dying last year from opiate overdoses.
Our healthcare system's a mess. And then you see what happened this week in Kentucky with the climate change, devastating almost entire states at this point. I mean, it is getting frightening. Transparency was a new buzzword in Europe. And what did they mean by that? And why did Americans reject this idea so strongly?
Well, transparency just means the ability to take in government at a glance. I mean, if a new government is voted into office, so this new government does X, Y, and Z, there's no question as to where responsibility lies and where accountability lies. If the British create a national health system, if the Labour Party creates a national health system, well, the Labour Party did it, and if you like it, you vote for the Labour Party. If you don't like it, you vote against the Labour Party. It's very, very clear, very simple, very transparent. In America, we have this crazy Congress, filled with loopholes and
committees
and backdoor, stairways and 1,000 different ways for each and every Congress member to evade responsibility.
Lobbyists.
Yeah, it's insane. And so therefore no one knows who's responsible for what. There's zero accountability, zero transparency. As I said before, it would take an investigative reporter 6 months really to determine the true story about how any single member voted.
Yeah, right. Greg Palast is out there trying to figure out who voted for what in the last election still, I think. I'm not sure he's figured it out yet, and it's been half a year. The thing is, I'm trying to connect, and I've said this before in the podcast, we're not talking about history. We are talking about history, but what I want to emphasize is that we are a product of that history. And if our listeners don't understand that, if we don't make the connection between the past and the present, then we'll never figure out where to go from here, And so I don't want the listeners to feel like, well, we're just talking about history and it's nice to know that this happened then and this happened there. This is more like trying to connect the dots about who we are as a society, how our government functions, what we can do about it. Because I'm very proactive about that. I really believe if I could get anything out of this podcast, I would like to see a movement towards developing a fully modern and democratic model of a constitution for the United States that people could look at and they would say, oh, that makes sense. This would work better than what we have. Something that if there's something concrete on paper, online for people to think about, it would make it much easier to have this conversation, don't you think?
Yes, but I'd take issue with your approach.
Okay.
To me, it's not the Constitution that comes first; it's democracy that comes first. Constitution flows out of democracy. So I think that what Americans have got to say is that they believe in one person, one vote, absolutely strictly, no deviation whatsoever. And to quote the Declaration of Independence, we create our governments to accomplish certain ends, and when those governments stop accomplishing those ends and sort of wind up doing the opposite. It's the right of the people to create new government in whatever way they see fit to accomplish those ends that they regard as important and in their interests, including such things as good school systems, public health, environmental protection, livable cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and dealing with the problem of global warming, also a matter of life and death. So to me, you've got to start with the principle of one person, one vote, and popular sovereignty, the idea that we, the people, control our society. And we have a right and even an obligation to shape it in a way that is in our long-term interests.
All right. I'll be talking to the folks in Iceland who did the more recent effort to recreate a constitution for Iceland, and they'll be joining me in this conversation in a month or so. And their experience was, well, it didn't go the way they hoped it would, because they asked the government itself to ratify the Constitution, and the government declined to do so. At least that's the shorthand version of the story I understand. So when you say one person, one vote, yes, I think it should stem from democracy as well. But 330 million Americans aren't going to get together and write a constitution either. Right. You know, and basically the one we have was established by 39 people signed on to the Constitution, I think, in the convention, and less than 2,000 people in the ratification conventions agreed to affirm it as well. So we have a political system that was designed and approved by less than 2,000 people.
Yeah, well, I think the number of people who actually voted for those ratification conventions was around 150,000. But they were all, the number of voters, some were voters, but still, I was out of a population of 4 million. And and they were all property owning white males.
There you go. Yeah, so we have that. This is America. Listen to that. I mean, your political system is 230 years old, and it was approved and created by less than 100. How many? 150,000.
150,000 people. That's the best estimate. All property owning.
Yeah.
Property owning white males.
It's remarkable. You know, after 230 years, okay, we have had a lot of success in many ways, but the democratic process in this country is driving us nuts. It's not working.
All right, so let me just cut to the chase really fast, if I may. A lot of people talk about a constitutional convention, which I actually oppose, because the Article 5, the amending clause, the Constitution actually outlines what a convention would mean. And the convention could make recommendations, but those recommendations must be approved in the same old manner by 2/3 of each house plus 3/4 of the states, which means that the same old minority rule, provisions would remain in place, because there's no way that Wyoming or the Dakotas will vote to reduce their power in any kind of revamped constitutional setup. So what I call for is something that political scientists call a constituent assembly.
Yeah, there you go. I like that idea myself. Yeah,
that's an assembly not under Article 5, but under the preamble.
Right.
The preamble says, we the people, in order to do this, and this, approve a new constitution, and in the process, even though it doesn't say it, toss overboard the existing constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation. So essentially, I want to have a constituent assembly of we the people who would essentially toss out the existing constitution and, under their own authority, essentially put a new legal order in place. That constituent assembly, obviously, you can't get 330 million people into a single hall or even a single Zoom meeting. So they have to elect representatives, but they should elect representatives on the basis of strict proportional representation. And that's the only way to translate one person, one vote to action. That means people vote from a common list. You have a Labor Party, a capitalist party, a free drugs party, a be kind to animals party, a better beer party, whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
And if party A gets 15% of the vote, they get 15% of the seats.
Right.
And same thing with parties B, C, D, and E.
So in your view, would it be the legitimate source for ratification, or would it still be up to the American people in a general popular vote whether to adopt it or not?
I would actually go for the former myself, but that's up to the people.
Yeah.
In other words, a democratic convocation of that sort would have immense authority. It'd have infinite authority because it'd be the most democratic expression of the American people to date.
Yeah, I think it's what Sanford Levinson is proposing, something like that. But he recommends a lottery, I think, in terms of selecting the members of the Constituent Assembly.
And a guy named Akil Reed Amar, a professor at Yale, also proposed something along similar lines. The idea of an assembly based on the preamble. Although he fudged and was a little vague on the details. Mm-hmm. And so that body would assemble a ruling committee, executive committee, based on 51% of the votes. Mm-hmm. It would draft a constitution. Mm-hmm. I believe create a powerful democratic government. Mm-hmm. Committed to the highest ideals of democracy. Mm-hmm. And the assembly could then say, okay, we'll put it up to a referendum. Or they could say, we feel we have enough power to rule for another 2 or 3 years, and then we will have an election in which everybody will stand or fall on how they voted, and that referendum will serve as that election will serve simultaneously as a referendum on the new Constitution. And if you don't like it, you can elect people committed to changing it, and they will be free to do that. I want to collapse the difference between constitutional law and ordinary law. I want each part, two sides of the same coin, and each rendered as fluid and democratic as possible. So that constitutional reform is always on the agenda. Mm-hmm. And a constitution is always a work in progress, a democratic work in progress, where we can tinker with it, modify it, improve it, toss it out the window and start from scratch as we, the people, so believe, mm-hmm. and according to a simple democratic majority vote. Now that's horrifying to the great majority of Americans who don't trust their own democratic ability. Mm-hmm. But
well, like Jefferson, you said the same thing about Jefferson, and he was afraid of it. He was concerned.
Yeah, because he was afraid because he thought his special privileges would be eliminated, as they would be.
As what could happen today to people who have far too much wealth than they need.
54% of the country lives in 10 states. Mm-hmm. Which are outvoted 4-1 in the Senate by the minority in the other 40 states.
Wow.
It gets worse. 81% of minorities live in the top 10. And this is structural racism.
Yeah.
Now we don't want to take away privileges from white people or give them to black people or whatever, or Asians or whatever. We want to put them on precisely the same footing.
Right.
And we want them to democratically get together and decide how they want to run their country and how they want to deal with these vast problems that are bearing down on us.
Right. In a recent essay, you wrote People or Parchment. You wrote, who rules, the people or a piece of parchment? The Constitution is perfect because it's impervious to change and vice versa. This is exceptional, all right, as well as more than a bit odd. After all, cars, washing machines, vacuum cleaners all run down from time to time. So why not the U.S. machinery of government? Why should it be spared the usual wear and tear? This would seem to be the case, especially given the news out of Washington these days about gridlock, high wire negotiations, and government shutdowns. And that you wrote in 1996, and I would argue it's become only much worse since then. So this idea that Americans grapple with to improve their system of government, to literally change their constitution so that they have a political system that works better for them. That's what we're struggling with. That's what we're trying to understand. And so, Daniel, we're going to have to come back and talk about this, because setting up a constituent assembly, I think for most people, it's hard to conceive how Americans would do that, let alone why. But so we need to talk more about that and figure out what the next steps will be. I know in the next episode, we're going to talk to Stephen Taylor, who's an associate of Aaron Lippert, and we're going to talk about the differences between our democracy and those more modern, more developed democracies in Europe. So, this is the idea here. And again, I want to emphasize, this is not just about history. This is about who we are today. And, what you're doing, what you've written, Daniel, the books that you've been, I want to talk about the Velvet Coup. I mean, there's so much more that we can cover. And I've only, trust me, I've only scratched the surface of your book. So, but I so much appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you today. Are there any thoughts that you have on the recent Democracy Summit held by President Biden?
Oh, it's just silly. I mean, America, first of all, is in no position to lecture the rest of the world. Its own democracy is in deep trouble. Mm-hmm. Number two, it's clear that that many, if not most, of the choices were dictated by strategic considerations rather than democracy. I mean, no one knows why Pakistan should be there. Mm-hmm. Pakistan's a country with an extraordinarily state of breakdown. Mm-hmm. And so on. So it just kind of made the hollowness of the whole process apparent to the world.
It's stunning to me. It's really remarkable that he got up there and decided to do that. It's almost, it looks to me like an act of desperation to try to keep the charade going a little bit longer. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, Afghanistan was a huge shock. Afghanistan just revealed 20 years of complete incompetence and a deep air of unreality.
Yeah, that's what I pointed that out to the presidential system, which I hope in my lifetime I see abolished and replaced with a parliamentarian system. I would like to see that happen in the next couple of years. But you had 4 presidents who spent trillions of dollars in Afghanistan. You had one president, George Bush, who made a decision to go to war in Iraq, which I believe is an illegal war, and 1 million people died because one president had the authority to do that. I mean, I'm shocked in a way that the rest of the world is not up in arms about that, and so many other things that the United States has done globally to interfere with other political systems and countries. It's as Chomsky said, we're a rogue nation. We're I think the most feared nation on the planet.
It's breaking down really rapidly. I mean, the pace of breakdown is accelerating. The U.S. radiates, even when it tries to be strong, it radiates weakness. And Joe Biden, I mean, he's a hack from way back on Capitol Hill, and he's trying to be tough against both Russia and China. No one has any confidence in how he's doing this. What his strategy is, and the great danger is that some kind of awful mistake will be made. No one wants war. People don't seek out war. They usually blunder into wars. And the great danger is the U.S. and its state of breakdown and senility will just stumble into something really, really bad, either in the Black Sea or the South China Sea.
Yeah, there's more talk this morning on the news, which I tend to listen to less and less every day, about the insurrectionists and those guys making a return in the 2024 elections. And so that's another reason why I feel like what we're talking about in this podcast is really critical. We need to get this conversation started as soon as possible, because I'll have Harvey J.K. back at some point. He said, he was afraid that if this conversation got off the ground, the people that would make most of it would be the right wingers, the insurrectionists. Those guys would take it over, and we'd end up with some kind of fascist government before the day was over. But I think I do disagree with that. I think that progressive America is a majority in this country. I think that those ideas are stronger and just so much more logical, that there's every reason to believe that a conversation about a new constitution could be very successful and wonderful for this country. And again, it's like, if we can't use our brains instead of our bullets, then there's just no point in going forward. We have to think our way out of this mess, and we have to act logically and methodically to get there. And I hope that this is part of that process.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, great. Well, Daniel, thanks for the conversation, Daniel. It's been great, and I hope that we can do it again. But for now, I guess we'll end there, and hope that this conversation continues.
I hope so too. It's been great.